So welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. Today we are talking about Thomas Paine and his pamphlet, Agrarian Justice. So Thomas Paine was basically the guy who incited the American Revolution when he wrote his pamphlet, Common Sense. And that was in 1774. And then 20 years later, over 20 years later, he wrote another pamphlet called Agrarian Justice, which was mostly addressing, well, he was addressing the issues that were happening in France at the time. France was undergoing their revolution, and he wanted the societal revolution to live up to the political revolution. He wanted some of his ideas are thought of today as precursors to what we now think of as basic income. So he wanted to provide everyone a grant of money when they reached 21 years old, and he wanted to pay everyone a yearly sum after they reached the age of 50. So kind of like an old age pension. So yeah, some of us have read the pamphlet, Agrarian Justice, and we're going to be talking about quotes and to what extent his views do line up with basic income, and his plan lines up with basic income, and to what extent his arguments are reasonable arguments to support the idea of basic income. Are they useful today? So yeah, without further ado, we will get started with a quote. Here we go. To understand what the state of society ought to be, it is necessary to have some idea of the natural and primitive state of man, such as it is at this day among the Indians of North America. There is not, in that state, any of those spectacles of human misery which poverty and want present to our eyes in all the towns and streets of Europe. Poverty, therefore, is a thing created by that which is called civilized life. It exists not in the natural state. On the other hand, the natural state is without those advantages which flow from agriculture, arts, science, and manufactures. So what do you guys think about that?
The Native Americans' life was not miserable. He'll go on to say that life was not miserable because there was so much land per person.
Right.
And so he's heading toward showing the importance of land as a population increases.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, this point that in the natural state of humanity, there is no poverty, and as a result of civilization, of cities, we get these extremes. We get this poverty among plenty, that kind of thing. And Henry George kind of called attention to this same thing when he was writing, almost 100 years later, 80 years later, maybe. Yeah. So I think this is it's an interesting point, and I think it's true. And I think it does a good job of highlighting the fact that we're not reaching our full potential in human prosperity. The fact that we know we have these advances that are capable of making people better off than they were before, and it's not, at least not working for everyone, that's a sign that there's potential to do better. So I think that part I think is really important. Because, I think some people might look at the world and say, oh, there always has to be, poor people because it's what's necessary for society to function or something like that. And I think this calls that into question to some extent.
So it's the beginning of a 200-year tradition of pointing out that in this, the most prosperous nation in the world, there are still so many people in misery.
Right. He was the Bernie Sanders at the time. Yeah. Phoenix Congress on the live stream says, it seems like poverty would still occur in a natural state after a famine or similar event. And I think you didn't really have famines, at least not how we think about them, until the advent of agriculture. So you had a bad crop or something like that. Before that, we had tribes, and if there wasn't enough food, they would go somewhere else. Certainly tribes could die off and things like that.
And they can like dry their food in like jerky or something like that?
Yeah, and I think, I think if there was, a shortage of food, people would kind of starve and die. They wouldn't go on surviving. Whereas agriculture created this kind of subsistence level of survival where people were poor, but they could just keep kind of going on living in that poor state. And I don't think that was true before. Yeah. So I think, and then my mom brings up the point, no poverty because nobody is rich. I think that's the point about relative poverty versus absolute poverty. I think Paine is right that it's not just relative poverty. It's not just the richness of the rich people highlighting how poor the poor are. I think in the cities in Europe or anywhere, the poor people there are worse off than the average person in more primitive cultures, tribal cultures. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in the national state, the land was rich.
The land was rich, and we hadn't, I guess in some sense the land still is rich, and we've developed technologies to extract more of that richness or benefit from more of that richness, and it hasn't resulted in everyone becoming better off.
They're like tales about the rivers just full of fish, and they just barely used it, and so they just kept replenishing itself. Well, today it takes for a long time to replenish itself.
Right, you didn't have overfishing by and large, and if you did, if some tribe did something that damaged its survival, it just wouldn't survive. So the tribes that remained were the ones that were kind of using the resources efficiently and sustainably and that kind of thing. And they moved from place to place too, so it wasn't just, people didn't really start settling down in locations until we had agriculture and cultivation of land. Yeah.
They were nomadic.
There's no what?
They were nomadic?
They were nomadic, yeah. Not necessarily like 100% nomadic, like they might have regions that they move within and stuff like that. So here's the next one. It is always possible, and this is what Steve was pointing out, it is always possible to go from the natural to the civilized state, but it is never possible to go from the civilized to the natural state. The reason is that man in a natural state, subsisting by hunting, requires 10 times the quantity of land to range over to procure himself sustenance. That would support him, then would support him in a civilized state, where the earth is cultivated. When, therefore, a country becomes populous by the additional aids of cultivation, art, and science, there is a necessity of preserving things in that state, because without it, there cannot be sustenance for more, perhaps than a 10th part of its inhabitants. The thing, therefore, now to be done is to remedy the evils and preserve the benefits that have arisen to society by passing from the natural to that which is called the civilized state. So I think that's right. If we're using resources, the fact that we figured out how to use resources and land a lot more efficiently, get more benefit out of the same amount of land by developing civilization and agriculture and specialization and trade and all of that. That means that we've increased the carrying capacity of the land through those institutions. If we get rid of those institutions, a lot of people are going to have to die in order to kind of get back to the sustainable way of life. And that's, yes. And he's kind of building to a point here.
That's what's happening with climate change, with people like from like Bangladesh or whatever moving to other places.
In what sense?
They're not the land of, and since the sea level or whatever is increasing, then the country's not able to sustain them, so they have to move.
Yeah, and how does that tie into?
And so they're going from the civilized state of Bangladesh to the shanty towns or whatever in India or whatever.
Yeah, so you're talking about the refugee phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
So what ends up happening in the real world is that you get these refugee camps, you get clusters of poverty and people kind of hanging on and being supported at a subsistence level that is it's not the same thing as just like there's some poor people in the city. It's like you can kind of get whole groups of people who are suffering in this way. That's different, of course, from if we lost our technological advancement altogether and went back to having to subsist in tribes, then a lot of people would straight up die. Instead, we have a lot of people living in poverty.
There would be lost technology, of course, with people finding like a machine gun or something like that in a mine, and so they get a temporary advantage over people and reclaim land.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, I think it's true that if you have fewer people, you lose cultural knowledge and you lose technology.
Well, that's what happened with the Neanderthals. They lost their technology each generation because they didn't lack the ability to pass it along because they lacked the ability to speak.
Oh, I'm talking more about if you have fewer people, there are fewer people to carry on the knowledge. So as the population shrinks, you lose information. And
also with the elders would die off faster, so they wouldn't have an opportunity to pass it on to the younger generations.
So yeah, I mean, but then it's kind of a chicken egg thing. Like, why did we end up in a situation where where we don't have as many people? So I kind of when I was initially talking about it, I was saying what if we lost all our technology? Then we'd have to, a lot of people would have to die. But also, if a lot of people died for some other reason, we would lose the technology as well. So either one can be the cause. So any more comments about this quote?
Well, let's see. In the natural state, they didn't have to worry about rationing out the land. There was enough land. But with civilization, the process of rationing out the land actually became a problem, an issue.
Yeah.
I'm calling it rationing out the land because I think that ownership of land as personal property is just one way of chopping up the land for people.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. As there became more of us, we had to develop a system for deciding who gets to use the land.
Actually, I think that land was always chopped up, like with jaguars and things. They have their own territories, and then with tribes, small groups of people, they have their own territories, and they fought over it all the time. And even with chimpanzees, they have their own territories, and they fight over it. And so there was always territories.
I think that's true, definitely true to some extent. One of the differences is that in modern society, the people who belong to the same society often do not have access to the land that everyone else has access to, that kind of thing. So with the tribes, at least everyone in the tribe had access to the land that the tribe had access to, and they kind of shared it, and they protected the territory, that kind of thing.
But the tribes only had 20 or 150 people at most, and they were all interrelated, so they were like a family.
Yes, but now we've created these social structures that are analogous kind of to gigantic families in the form of cities. So you have this there wasn't poverty among plenty. There wasn't people who didn't have access to the resources of the tribe. Now our cities are so big and our societies are so big that it's not just a cooperative thing where everyone can kind of share the resources, and it can't be because the resources need to be allocated and rationed. Land needs to be rationed among the people within the society. Yeah.
So Richard does point out that the usual way it's been rationed is by war, by violence.
It's a good point.
Up, from the natural state up to the present. That is the current way of solving land ownership problems.
Yeah, that is a good point. So we did have. So yeah, you're right, Richard.
Jaguars fought over their own territory. Chimpanzees have war.
So we did have a way of rationing territory, a way of rationing land, and war is obviously, if you can do it without, killing people, that's better for people. So we've developed other ways of rationing it. But back when it was war, you could fight for what you wanted, or your tribe could fight for what you wanted, and maybe you'd lose the war. And that,
And then they become slaves.
I guess that happened too. I don't know. I kind of want to get back to this issue of how poverty is a product of civilization, right? It's a result of civilization, and it has to do with. And I think this connection that Thomas Paine is making is accurate. That it does have to do with the fact that we are rationing land more efficiently, or we need to ration land more efficiently to sustain more people, to carry more people. And that rationing, at least the way that it's been operating, it hasn't been automatically providing for everyone. So you get poor people. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, you can't go back. But I think, like I was saying before, I think it is possible to do better. We can use resources more efficiently. So it kind of, if you just think about it logically, it has to be possible that everyone can be at least as well off as they were kind of in the natural state that Paine is talking about. So here's the next quote, which is really just the next paragraph. In taking the matter upon this ground, the first principle of civilization ought to have been, so we say what I just said, and ought still to be, that the condition of every person born into the world after a state of civilization commences ought not to be worse than if he had been born before that period. But the fact is that the condition of millions in every country in Europe is far worse than if they had been born before civilization began, or had been born among the Indians of North America at the present day. I will show how this fact has happened. So obviously he was living in a time before, a lot of bad things happened to the Indians of North America.
Genocide.
Yeah, and you could argue that a lot of the Indians who are living today on reservations are in the state of poverty that he's talking about.
Yeah, I guess Native Americans would disagree with all this entirely. That European white civilization, when born in America, gets a share of the land. It's not something I would agree with.
Yeah. So he's like drawing this comparison to the Native Americans, and but he's also saying that the white Europeans should have a right to all of this.
Fortunately, he's writing about France.
Yes,
which makes it simple.
Yes, he's writing. Yeah, So I mean, it should be possible, and I think basic income, money, is a means of distributing benefits to people through the economy, giving people access. If they have money and they want to buy land, they could buy land with that money, or they could buy the products that are created by the resources of land, or other resources like technology and whatever else is happening in our economy. Money is what gives you access. So he's talking about giving people money. He's kind of. So I like this logic that we know we can do better. But he talks about it more from, in other parts of the article, he talks about it more from a moral perspective, or that, like, people should have the right to such and such because we inherited the earth and that kind of thing. And I like this better. It's like the fact that we can do better means why shouldn't we be doing better for people?
Yeah, he is sort of drawing a poverty line.
Yeah.
Drawn at where somebody in a sort of a Garden of Eden state of nature would have been.
Right. Yeah, that's true. And I think that's somewhat limiting because we can probably do better than that too. So I like to say we should maybe set basic income to the highest level that the economy can handle, and then maximize people's prosperity. So here's the next quote. It is a position not to be controverted that the earth in its natural uncultivated state was, and ever would have continued to be, the common property of the human race. In that state, every man would have been born to property. He would have been a joint life proprietor with the rest in the property of the soil and in all its natural productions, vegetable and animal. So I think that position can be controverted. The idea that the earth in its unnatural state is the common property of the human race. I mean, I suppose it's de facto true in the sense that, generally speaking, humanity has access to the resources of the land, and nobody's putting down farms that they have to, fence off and that kind of thing. So I guess that part is incontrovertible. But
even animals fence off their territory, like marking it with urine or whatever.
Yeah, but it doesn't feel like a property thing. Like, property to me feels like a right, whereas in the natural uncultivated state, it's just that stuff was available.
Pick berries, hunter gatherer.
Yeah, maybe this is splitting hair. And like, would we say that the air is the property of humanity now because everyone gets to breathe? In some sense, yeah, but I don't know. It's not.
Some people get to pollute it, and other people don't get to use it.
Well, yeah, that's also an issue as well. Steve, you have
I think it's just his way of allocating the land. I don't know that it's any morally or ethically more defensible than that.
It's a simplification, I guess.
Now, my teenager, the environmentalist, would probably say that the land in an uncultivated state is not the property of anybody.
Yeah, right.
Other than nature itself.
Right.
Yeah, but in that state, you have to worry about grizzly bears and wolves hunting you down.
Well, but it's that nature that has, the environmentalist way, has the first rights to the land. Right. And humans impinging on that would have to defend their reasoning in doing that.
So my mom was asking what page we're on. We're on page 8 right now. I'll announce the page numbers with the quotes. We got a couple more quotes on page 8, actually. So Phoenix Congress says, even without agriculture, sources of clean water might have been controlled by certain tribes to the exclusion of others. Yeah, that's true. I think the biggest thing is just that there were more resources available per person back then, and it didn't really have to be allocated as efficiently because there weren't as many people.
Yeah, you can dam it, and then you can release the water and flood the entire other tribe out, and then you can reclaim the land there.
Yes, there's lots of ways that tribes could mess with other tribes. That's true. So let's go to the next one. Still page 8. But the earth in its natural state, as before said, is capable of supporting but a small number of inhabitants compared with what it is capable of doing in a cultivated state. And as it is impossible to separate the improvement made by cultivation from the earth itself upon which that improvement is made, the idea of landed property arose from that inseparable connection. But it is nevertheless true that it is the value of the improvement only, not the earth itself, that is individual property. Every proprietor, therefore, of cultivated land owes to the community a ground rent, for I know of no better term to express the idea, for the land which he holds. And it is from this ground rent that the fund proposed in this plan is to issue.
Yeah, so you might have done the farming or you might have built the house, but you didn't build the land in the first place. So you never deserve to own the land. And so some other system has to come up with it, and he's saying common ownership.
Common ownership of the uncultivated portion
Right.
of the land. Yeah, that people get compensated for. And that's an interesting way to think about it. But I also think it's true that once humanity does cultivate, does develop technology and develop resources, even though those developments were created by certain individual people, it makes sense at a certain point to also share that with everyone else. If your goal is to maximize human prosperity, then the only reason you would want to ensure that people get to monopolize the things they create is to the extent that you want to provide them an incentive to create those things in the first place. So I think there's a balance there, and I think this is it's kind of similar to what Henry George was talking about. Only tax the land, don't tax the improvements on the land. But if those improvements have been there, for thousands of years, humans thousands of years ago made them, and the improvements are not being used, you might want to tax that too. It kind of becomes, we change the environment, we change the earth, and we do it to our advantage. And I don't see that there's such a clear line between the natural state of the earth and what we've done to improve it, in terms of what's best for allocating to people, or the best system for allocating resources to people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess so. Will become a problem. There's some more modern problems, like you can develop some earth by turning it into a farm. That improves it.
Yeah.
But if you use the land for mining or oil extraction, you've actually
Depleted the land.
Yes.
Which seems like the public should be compensated for you ruining it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Or you have to plant trees or something and to make it somewhat better.
Yeah, so that's one way of compensating the public. I think, it's an interesting point. And then you could combine the two and say there's this human improvement to the land that someone else comes in and destroys or extracts, does that deserve compensation too, even though it was not a natural thing? And I think probably, you want to, I think these are interesting questions. So, in terms of just resource usage and resource allocation, if there's a person or a company that's using up resources, extracting resources and expending them in a way that's not sustainable, the question is, what's the cost to society and what's the benefit to society? Obviously, if you're mining coal or something like that, you're messing up that environment, but you're also providing energy for people, which messes up the environment even further. But there's all these different things. So it's kind of
you benefit society in the short term, but then you mess it up in the long term.
Sure. So I think there's all these different things that we can kind of frame in okay, you did this thing, or you did this damage, and now you need to compensate people for it. But maybe a slightly different framing of what's the best way to allocate resources and what incentives do we want to provide? Like, is it a good thing that all that coal got mined and used in our economy? Or would we want to create an incentive for our economy to use less coal and more alternatives to coal? So then I think that's how you decide what the tax should be, or even what the subsidy should be. Like, what behavior do you want out of people? So I think I would, even though it is a punishment or a reward on some level, the reason for the punishment or the reward is to try to incentivize the optimal behavior. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm picturing a sort of a public agent, a landlord, a broker representing the land, the publicly owned land, sort of entertaining offers. One guy wants to drill for oil. Well, some land has oil, so that land will rent for a lot. The public will make a lot out of that. And then Death Valley, the public might pay homesteaders to go develop it. Negative rent.
But that changes in each administration. Like in the Obama administration, he created all these reserves and things like that. But in the Trump administration, he's actually giving it away and so that people can exploit it.
So I think it's definitely true that depending on the politics, we make different decisions about this at different times.
I think that's fine. In fact, in radical markets, they suggest that at least the land is up for auction all the time, every minute. So if one day oil is discovered in Texas, then immediately that land goes up in value, and the value of everything is always changing, depending on everything else. It might be nicer if there was a public representative. So somebody wants to drill for oil in Yosemite or Niagara Falls or something. The public guy should say, no, we're going to leave that in the natural state.
Yeah.
But
excuse me. I think Kyle on the live stream makes a good point. He says there's no reason to be absolute purists in regards to the environment. That's impossible. The proper course is finding a healthy balance of extraction and preservation. And I think that's right. Or you can even say extraction and conservation. Because maybe it's not just like you're preserving nature because you like nature, but you want to conserve resources as well that humanity can use later, or the economy can use in the future, that kind of thing. What were you saying, Richard?
Well, there's actually exploitation in natural parks due to the Trump administration. Like with the Bears Ears National Park or something like that?
So I think, I mean, this is all interesting stuff, and, kind of the politics can shift, and the policy can shift because the politics shift. I don't think we need to really be getting into specific examples of things that are happening right now due to shifts in politics, that kind of thing. But more on kind of like a theoretical level, or, what is optimal for society, and, what was Thomas Paine thinking, and do we think that his way of thinking about it would lead to an optimal policy, that kind of thing? Those are the questions I want to be asking. Yeah.
Well, but I still think, like Richard is suggesting, that even the public interest will change.
Yes.
Like my brother-in-law bought like 30 acres in New Hampshire, and he gets a tax break if he promises to not develop it. Sort of the negative Homestead Act.
Yeah.
You get to own it and hike in it as long as you don't civilize it. So that the opposite of how it used to be, but that's how the public interest changed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's
that's sort of like the farms, the farms in the West, where they pay you not to do anything with it.
Yeah, nowadays. they'll let you buy the ranch as long as you do nothing.
Right.
Yeah.
Part of why they sold it to you. Okay, so now we're moving on to page 9. Let's see, where are we? Here we go. I have entitled this tract Agrarian Justice to distinguish it from agrarian law. Nothing could be more unjust than agrarian law in a country improved by cultivation. For though every man, as an inhabitant of the earth, is a joint proprietor of it in its natural state, it does not follow that he is a joint proprietor of cultivated earth. The additional value made by cultivation after the system was admitted became the property of those who did it, or who inherited it from them, or who purchased it. It had originally no owner. Whilst, therefore, I advocate the right and interest myself in the hard case of all those who have been thrown out of their natural inheritance by the introduction of the system of landed property, I equally defend the right of the possessor to the part which is his. So he's kind of drawing a hard line here, and this is kind of what I was objecting to a little bit before. I don't think it's optimal for society to say, these people many generations ago created this improvement, and because they were the ones who created it and it had no previous owner, that means their heirs and descendants are the only ones who get the benefit from it. I don't think that's optimal for human society. It certainly doesn't, doing it that way doesn't improve the incentives for the people to create the thing in the first place, right? The fact that hundreds of years later their descendants get exclusive ownership of it isn't part of their, if they knew that, they don't even know that's going to happen anyway, because, they can't plan that far in the future and they're not going to be alive and all of that. So I think I think he's taking too hard a line here, too hard a stance. Yeah.
Like with I heard that the people who became the chiefs or whatever, because they were able to organize people to create irrigation ditches and things like that, and that's how they organized their people and pass that tradition along.
So that's an interesting question. Who should own the land? The people who should own the improvements? The people who ordered them to be done, or the people who physically did the work? If the workers were hired, then maybe they're being compensated for the work that they've done. So maybe it makes sense that they wouldn't have a right to just own the product outright. But maybe if they were slaves, then that's a different story and that kind of stuff. My mom says it's hard to draw a line between the land and what's developed on it, and I think that's right. And Paine emphasizes that it's hard to physically separate the improvements from the land. You can't separate the farm from the land underneath it and give people access to the land without giving them access to the farm and that kind of thing. But it's also true that it's hard to especially over time, it can become harder and harder to define what is the original land and what is the development and what are the values of these things. It's not an easy thing to do. And as we saw with Henry, when we were talking about Henry George, and he's talking about calculating the land value tax, it's this algorithm of looking around, what are the values of the things in the area. And when George is talking about the land value tax, the value of the bare land, the natural land, is also in his calculation determined by the improvements on the surrounding land. That's a really key thing for Henry George. And Paine does not really get into that aspect of it either.
Well, in my town, if you improve your house a lot and its market value goes up a lot, then the property tax you have to pay goes up.
Right.
And I guess people are all right with that. Even though it was they who improved it and not the town.
Right.
Your assessment goes up, and you have to pay a higher property tax because of good things you did to your house.
And I think Henry George would say, no, you can't do that. That's, ruining everyone's incentives to improve things.
And with my brother's house in Boston, they actually, up until recently, he lived in the house, and so it's an owner-proprietor house, and so they paid him the taxes like up to like $3,000 or something like that, which took care of his entire property tax.
Oh, because he was supplying more housing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, and that would be in the public. So the public decided it's in the public interest to.
But it has to be. He has to live in it and provide a tenant,
right?
Which was me, or is me.
So Kyle says, "I don't see why this line is." No, he retracted his message. I think he figured it out, or he's going to rephrase it in another way. So let's go on to the next one.
You rephrased it.
He says, I don't see why this line is hard to draw. Land, in the economic sense, refers to the economic space and its contents that is created absent of human improvement. So I think, conceptually, the line is fairly easy to draw. Like, you can draw that line by saying what you just said. But when you go out into the world, it becomes harder. And Henry George grappled with this too. Like we were talking about, when he wanted a land value tax, he acknowledged that the value of the unimproved land was largely determined by the improvements that were made around that land, the human improvements that were made around that land.
Or if it could be like all the trees and providing a habitat for the deer that were hunted.
What?
That if you take down all the trees, then the deer won't want to be there anymore, so they won't be worthless for hunting ground.
So how does that relate to the line between the natural state of the land and the improvements?
Well, if the back in like the 1800s, the beaver pelts were worth a ton, and so if you take down all the trees, then there won't be any beaver pelts, and the beaver pelts might be worth more than the trees. And
so you're basically saying that the human effects on the land can also be the opposite of an improvement in terms of
it's like in the Amazon, they're chopping down all the trees to create cattle ranches and things, but that depletes the land, and that makes it worse off. So they have to chop down more land for cattle ranches.
Yeah, so I think Paine would argue that it's the same either way. If someone is controlling the land and using it, whether they're improving it or depleting it, that everyone else in society should be compensated for not being able to access the original value of the natural land, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let's see. Yeah. So I think. So Kyle says that's a good point, but in the economic sense, animals are just capital like corn. Moral arguments aside, yeah, I think that's right, and I think even if you do draw a line between the natural state of the land and the improvements on the land, that's not a good way of determining what the right incentives are for resource allocation. That's kind of an arbitrary distinction. In terms of the potential benefit that humanity can get from everything that's out there, you'd want to include the natural land, and you'd want to include the improvements that have been made by humanity as well, and how to allocate those most efficiently. The restriction that you would want to place on just allocating improvements evenly is that you run the risk of losing the incentives for people to create those improvements in the first place. So it's all about the incentives, and even though you might be able to draw a clear line between natural land and improvements, I don't think that's a useful thing to do in determining what should be taxed or what should be allocated. What was it? Rationed to different people, that kind of thing.
I'm just wondering so let's say you develop the land, and then since you only have to pay for the land but not what you built on it
Yeah.
for the next, hundreds of years, your descendants get to benefit from what you built on it. Well, so that doesn't. Well, so I'm
But
also
the land
wondering-
value tax is yearly.
Yeah, but it could still be. I mean, if it's just the plot of land under the Empire State Building, it'll be small compared to what's built on it.
Right.
But the value of the property is much higher than it was before because it provides an incentive to build other buildings around the Empire State Building, and so that increases that value of that.
I want to hear Steve finish his point.
Yeah, I should. What I'm getting to is that if you mine the land or pump out, take out all the gold, pump out all the oil, then similarly, wouldn't your descendants for hundreds of years have to pay for the damage that happened hundreds of years ago? I mean, if they're going to get the advantages, wouldn't they have to pay for the disadvantages?
In Thomas Paine's formulation?
Well, just in this issue of separating the land from what you did to the land, there seems to be something even more wrong with having descendants pay for what their ancestors did to damage the land hundreds of years before.
Yeah, so I guess the scenario you're describing is that someone owns the land, it has a certain natural value, they pay a ground rent on that value, then they extract the resources, and they still have to pay the same ground rent as before. Now nobody wants to buy the land from them because it comes with this really high ground rent that's really disproportionate to what the land is actually worth now.
It's a hole in the ground.
So all the descendants get stuck with it because they have to inherit this crappy land and nobody can sell it, and they still have to pay the taxes on it. Is that kind of the scenario?
Well, or if the descendants were gonna keep making money off the Empire State Building, wouldn't they have to keep paying money for the ruined land?
Well, I think he's more saying, they wouldn't be paying money. They'd just be they'd be paying the ground rent, and they'd be bearing the cost of having to own land that's useless. That would be the cost that they pay, right?
Well, Paine doesn't talk about destroying land. They couldn't do it.
Well,
back then, they couldn't do it like we can today.
Like we got really good at it.
Yeah.
I think we can just view destroying land as negative improvement, right?
Okay.
So you're not, if you have negative improvement, you're not going to benefit from it the way you would benefit from the Empire State Building, but you still have to pay the same ground rent. So the cost you pay is owning this land that is not valuable, but having to pay a high tax on it.
Well, it seems like it should be worse than that, just by
This is
symmetry.
just kind of extrapolating the Thomas Paine idea to destruction of land. I think you're right that what we would want to do is we would want to provide disincentives for people doing things that are bad.
Tax it at its original value.
What?
If you destroy the land, you tax it at its original value. So it provides a disincentive to do it in the first place.
Right. So that's kind of Paine's idea of how it would be done, or if you flip it from improvements to kind of depletion. But as Steve, I think, is rightly pointing out, now you're sticking your future generations with this bad asset, right?
Mm-hmm.
So since they're the ones who are paying most of the cost, you might not create enough of a disincentive for the person who's extracting all the oil and gold and benefiting from it right then, and then sticking it to future generations. Yeah,
I would rather that there was a broker, a deal maker on behalf of the public, who said, you're going to extract all the oil and you're going to leave a useless hole in the ground. So your rent is going to be very high. You have to pay the public a lot because you're going to ruin the land. And on the other hand, if Bugsy Siegel comes to you and says, I'm going to start building casinos in the middle of the desert that's not useful for anything, you might say, oh, that's great because we have nothing else to do with that land. You can rent all that for $1 a year because it's in the public interest that you create Las Vegas.
My feeling is that to create the right incentives for gold extraction and oil extraction, maybe a more direct way to do it is to tax the activity itself. Like you extract X amount of oil, there's a tax on oil extraction, right? So rather than taxing the land based on what people want to do with the land,
tax the resources itself.
Tax the resource extraction, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not even thinking of it as taxes. I'm thinking that the public is a landlord of all the land.
Right.
And it's they just rents out lots on an individual basis.
Well, rent and tax, potato. Right? Yeah. So I guess rent is a more restrictive form of tax, which is just like kind of a regularly paid thing.
Royalties.
For continued access or exclusive access to something. So property taxes are a form of rent, whereas sales taxes are not really a form of rent.
Yeah. Or it's not a tax in the sense that you need to give the government money because the government's going to do something for you. It's just plain old landlord rent.
Right. Yeah, and I think that would be true if you're just doing the Pigovian tax of resource extraction, right? Like you're taxing that activity not because the government's going to do something for you, but because the government wants to, make it so that you only do that thing if it's worth it in the presence of the tax. Yeah.
But then there's the issue of sweetheart deals where they undercharge you for the property.
Yeah, I mean, so there's certainly, there's always going to be inefficiencies and corruption and stuff like that. But that doesn't change. The overall goal of trying to achieve efficiency and incentives and that kind of thing. Like,
I would mention that in radical markets, they never have a government official making any decisions on it.
Is that right?
It's all self-assessed values, and that it determines how much tax you pay. But if you self-assess too low to lower your taxes,
right,
that
then someone
price
else can
becomes
steal
public.
Yeah.
And then anybody is allowed to buy it at that excessively low price that you stated publicly. Yeah. So it's a market solution that doesn't involve has a top bound and a bottom bound to keep things in control. It doesn't involve the government.
It strikes me as somewhat unnecessary because there's always a price you could get someone to sell something, right? Like you don't. Oh, I see. You're seeing people are under appraising their assets in order to pay lower taxes, and then they. Usually,
the problem with a self-assessed value is you make it too low to keep your taxes low.
Right.
But in radical markets, they suggest the common ownership self-assessed tax, where if you assess too low, your assessment is also telling the public, I will sell for this value. That's part of the rule of the game. Is your assessment means you will sell it at anything above that just for regular economic reasons. So you don't want to make it too low, or you'll be selling for less than it was worth to you.
Right.
So it keeps people being honest in their assessment without government officials and without a risk of corruption. So it's an all market solution.
Yeah.
But it's another way of running a common land ownership situation.
Right.
That's all.
So I guess I mean, this is I'm just kind of curious. This is a minor detail, but how do they? So what's to stop someone from saying, I'm going to be willing to sell it at this price and pay the low tax, and then someone comes along who says they want to buy it they want to buy it at that low price, and then the first person says, no, I actually just changed to a higher price.
Yeah.
And now I'm gonna pay the higher taxes. And then when that person goes away, they're like, oh, I'm going back to the lower price again.
I don't know that they I don't remember that they got into that.
Yeah.
They just freeze it for a certain amount of time at that lower price.
Yeah, it strikes me as it would get very complicated to try to, because the value of property changes over time too. So you would have to allow changes. You can't just say like, oh, you bought this thing. Now you have to accept that value for the entire time. So I don't know. It strikes me as like you'd have to have even more government intervention.
Well, they describe a sort of futuristic utopia where everything, you look on your smartphone and everything is up for auction all the time, and anybody can swoop in and buy anything.
Right. And then you're paying like continuous taxes on your stuff at all times or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it sounds clever and interesting, but it leads me to wonder kind of what's the point of it all.
Well, it's a Walrasian utopia where
with the
all prices instantly reflect all the knowledge in the world about them.
Although I think Walrus had distinct periods of, okay, now everyone's determining the prices, now all the sales happen at once, and there's like, it's like a periodic thing. One thing happens after the other. It's not like a continuous auctioning process. Yeah. But
it's like in Max Headroom. Richard and I use television shows as data.
Yeah.
In Max Headroom, the people performing, the people on camera see their ratings go up and down, and they change by the second based on their ratings. So that's the dystopia of constant updated information. Yeah,
it does sound. I don't know. It does sound kind of dystopic. And then another question is, why are we taxing these things to begin with? For land, it makes sense to have a rent, but then just for everything you own, like, why are you taxing, everyone's property? Like, it seems like extra complexity.
Well, other than, I guess they don't distinguish between, like with, my town's property tax assessment, they don't distinguish between the land and what's on the land.
Right.
They just take the currently assessed value.
Yeah.
And I guess in my town, I hadn't thought it through. In my town, if I tear down my house and extract all the oil and leave a useless dead hole in the ground, I guess my property taxes would in fact go down, as the land would be worth, the whole thing would be worth less than nothing. So.
Yeah. My sense is that what's optimal is to be somewhere in between. Like have a tax on the improvement, but not have it be quite as high as the tax on the land. That way you still have an incentive to improve, but you also have an incentive to use your improvements productively as well. So Phoenix Congress says, Brian says, the solution I heard was that if you raised your price, you had to pay back taxes for X years at that rate. So that's interesting, but it also causes some problems because the person who bought it from you or who buys it from you at the new price doesn't necessarily have to pay back taxes. So that just gets kind of complicated also. And then what is X, and what if there was a sudden improvement in the value of your land, and now you're paying taxes on something for which most of its life was not valuable? It just gets really complicated. Yeah. But let's get back to Thomas Paine. Yeah. Unless you had something you wanted to add, Steve.
No, I can't make that simpler. So.
Okay. So where were we? Where were we? We're on page 9. Yeah. So the next one is just the next paragraph. So bottom of page 9. We can start moving through this a little faster. Cultivation is at least one of the greatest natural improvements ever made by human invention. It has given to created earth a tenfold value, but the landed monopoly that began with it has produced the greatest evil. It has dispossessed more than half the inhabitants of every nation of their natural inheritance without providing for them, as ought to have been done, an indemnification for that loss, and has thereby created a species of poverty and wretchedness that did not exist before. He was kind of saying the same things he was saying before. Translating this into more practical terms is that we created improvements in human prosperity and left a bunch of people behind.
Yeah, somehow in the meantime, the landed monopoly, well, they ended up owning all the land, even though that doesn't really make any sense to own land.
Right.
Like conglomerates buying up all the small family farms, and so they can create a massive farm.
I don't know if it's exactly like that, because the conglomerate is paying the small farmers for their farm.
And then they can sell for much lower prices in the small family farm?
Yeah, I mean that's... So yeah, I guess you're saying this is an example of improvements in efficiency that don't necessarily get distributed to everyone. Or something like that.
Mm.
Yeah. So here's the next one. In advocating the case of the persons thus dispossessed, it is a right and not a charity that I am pleading for. But it is that kind of right which, being neglected at first, could not be brought forward afterwards, till heaven had opened the way by revolution in the system of government. Let us then do honor to the revolutions by justice. Let us then do honor to revolutions by justice, and give currency to their principles by blessings.
This is page 10.
This is page 10, top page 10. So what he's basically saying is, okay, you overthrew the French monarchy, now we have an opportunity to do things right. So translated to modern American. And I think when you're changing the government, that's an opportunity to fix the things that were broken in the old system. And he's making a case that this is one of the things that was broken in the old system.
I think as far as UBI is concerned, it's important that it is a right and not a charity.
Right.
If America had some sort of common land ownership or land tax, and that land tax went to pay the UBI would not be charity or welfare. It would just be a person's cut of the rent of the land. Every American would be a little bit a landlord, would be a rent taker, rather than a charity case. And I think this politically makes it sound a lot better.
Yeah.
Because nobody, certainly no landlord, Donald Trump doesn't seem to have lessened self-esteem and dignity because he's a rent taker.
He does not. That's true.
Taking rent as a UBI, or your UBI as rent that you are owed as a landlord, seems to be fine in America.
Yeah. And basic income is often framed as like citizens' dividend, national dividend, like framing it as like you're the owner and you're getting some of the profit. I would like, it would be nice if we could say this is something you get as a right as a citizen that's not charity, without having to tie it to necessarily these other justifications, like, oh, it's about the land or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But culturally, UBI is faced with the stigma of welfare and charity. And then there's the whole dignity of work thing. UBI would remove the imperative to work and the dignity of work and the spiritual blessings of work or whatever. But if you're just a landlord collecting rent, nobody complains about a landlord worried for his soul because he's missing the dignity of work because he collects rent for a living.
A lot of people actually do complain about that.
But the landlords themselves don't.
Oh no, they're not worried about it at all.
It's everybody else who's worried about it.
Yeah.
But the actual rent collector isn't suffering self-esteem and loss of dignity at all.
Right, whereas a welfare recipient might, and often would.
And we're told that they would, yes, that they would and are and all that.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if it's sufficient to just give it to everyone. And, seeing that it goes to everyone, you don't feel like you're being specially targeted or something, that this is just what people get. I'm not sure you need the story of, okay, we have this shared ownership of the land. If we're going to do the shared ownership thing, I would want to say, we're all human beings and the economy works for us and we have shared ownership of the economy as consumers. And basic income is what gives us the means of consumption, the means of access to the product of our shared economy that we all, by right, are a part of because we're people.
Okay, well, that's a different framing.
Yeah.
That, might not work as well as making it sound like a dividend of some kind.
Yeah. So, I think the reason I always push back so hard on the dividend thing is because I'm worried that it limits the potential of the basic income. So the optimal level of, land taxation or property taxation does not necessarily correspond with the optimal level of basic income in terms of like the maximum amount of consumer spending the economy can productively respond to.
Yeah.
But maybe there's a case to be made for saying we should do the dividend argument now and the ownership argument now and get the basic income implemented. Then once people get used to it, we can say like, oh hey, the basic income could be even bigger. Let's do that, and then kind of have it be a stepwise process.
Yeah, it's it depends on how much you want to get into the cultural battle.
Yeah.
Personally, it's a messy battle. I'm trying to avoid it by sticking on the economic side entirely.
Yeah. So, So my mom says on the live stream, similarities to reparations here. She's talking about the quote. So I think the key difference between what Thomas Paine wants to do and reparations is that reparations are primarily about back pay for previous injustice. Paine just wants to fix the working of the system and, no, I guess you're right, because it's indemnification for the loss of the natural ownership. But he's not paying people back for the time that they missed not having that compensation in the past. So I guess there is some similarity. So Kyle says, how would a basic income avoid causing rent inflation in the absence of a land value tax? If you think about basic income, one of the main things it does is it increases the proportion of your income that is not tied to a job and therefore not tied to a location. So basic income gives people more freedom to choose where to live. That means, like landlords are always going to want to charge as much rent as possible. They do now and they will in the future. So the question is, how much rent are they going to be able to extract from the tenants? And when people are getting their jobs more from a basic, or getting their money more from a basic income and less from jobs, that means that people are less locked in to an individual location. So the amount of rent that tenants are willing to pay under a basic income is likely to go down. And that means that rents kind of have to come down if you implement a basic income.
They can always move somewhere else where the rents are lower.
That's right. You can imagine basic income as creating a whole new supply of housing because it gives people more freedom to live in more different places. So it's like you flooded the market with more houses. You're reducing in a particular area, you're reducing the demand for housing, so the rents have to come down to correspond with it. And then the land value tax itself could be useful for getting landowners to use their land more profitably, but it's not necessary for a basic income. And obviously, you wouldn't want to set the basic. If you set the basic income too high, then that's more than what the economy can handle, and you'd see a period of inflation until the purchasing power of the basic income is back down to
equilibrium.
Back down to a level the economy can sustain. If you're curious, Kyle, I've written an article about basic income in the housing market. Let me just actually link you to that right now. There it is. Here it is. Universal basic income fixes the housing market. You guys have any more comments before we move on to the next one? Next one is just the next two paragraphs. Here's the exciting part. Or, it's all exciting, but here's another exciting part. Having thus, in a few words, opened the merits of the case, I shall now proceed to the plan I have to propose, which is to create a national fund out of which there shall be paid to every person when arrived at the age of 21 years the sum of £15 sterling as compensation in part for the loss of his or her natural inheritance by the introduction of the system of landed property, and also the sum of £10 per annum during life to every person now living of the age of 50 years and to all others as they shall arrive at that age. So it's certainly a basic income for people over the age of 50. I don't know that I would classify this. I would say that this qualifies as a basic income. I don't think it does enough. It's a little bit tricky because where do you draw the age requirement line on something like a basic income? Should a baby get it? We're actually going to be talking about that next week. But I think generally speaking, so here's one way to think about it. So in our economy, we tend to expect people to get their income from jobs. So I would say that basic income, it would make sense for that to go to everybody who's of an age where you would expect someone of that age might have a job in our current way of thinking about things. So maybe a baby wouldn't get it, but people under the age of 50 should. So I think that kind of disqualifies this from being a true basic income, but it has some features of basic income, which I think you'd probably see. You'd see some similar economic effects. If everyone over the age of 50 had an unconditional income at the same level, then that has an effect on the economy. They have money to spend. They can be consumers. They can get the benefit from the economy. With Social Security right now, first of all, the age is higher, but it's also true that not everyone gets the same amount. So it's more basic income-y than our retirement system, our Social Security, old age pension, public pension thing.
Yeah, but in other countries, they all get the same amount.
Yeah, so this is more analogous to what they might do in some of the other countries. I wouldn't call it basic income. sometimes I meet people and they're like, oh, this country has a basic income because everyone of retirement age gets this certain amount of money, or this country has a basic income because they have a child allowance that's universal, or that goes to all children. It's like these things aren't really basic incomes, but they do provide some of the same benefits. Yeah. So I guess there's two aspects of the Thomas Paine thing. One is how basic income is his plan, and then to what extent are his arguments kind of relevant in supporting the idea of basic income. I like the idea of societies getting more productive and not everyone's sharing in it, and they could be. I think that's very supportive of something like a basic income.
Now he has a particular problem in that the injustice has already been committed. All of the land in France is owned.
Right.
So he has to retrofit his clever scheme onto that.
Right. He's not reallocating the land directly per se, but he's reallocating some money from ownership of the land, which, if you do it properly in a market economy, means some of the land might get sold to the people who are getting the money, who would be maybe happier to pay the taxes on it than the people who are holding it now, that kind of thing.
It has his plan at the last 2 pages of the article.
Right. Yep.
I'm just curious if, for instance, the American frontier 200 years ago, or Antarctica today, or the deep ocean today, or the moon today, if the land is not owned, how would Thomas Paine go about it to do it right the first time around?
That's a good question. My guess is that he'd probably do the same thing. He'd say, this land is worth a certain amount, we're going to tax it at a certain amount, and then he sets the tax at the level that makes it so that all the land ends up getting used, or something like that. If he sets it too high, then there's some land that gets unused. If he sets it too low, then there's people who want land who can't get it eventually.
All right.
Yeah.
So the issue would be to incentivize the most use in the public interest.
Yeah, I mean, his justification for what the amounts of the tax should be in this article are somewhat wishy-washy. So, yeah, I guess I'm imagining, I'm naturally falling back onto incentives, like how do you get the land used efficiently, that kind of thing. He wasn't necessarily thinking in that way, although he was a little bit, because he was talking about the benefits of the land not going to everyone and that kind of thing. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. But
at a certain point, there's not going to be enough moon, assuming that there's desirable things about the moon, or living on the moon, or mining the moon.
Well, there's helium-3 and water up there.
Eventually, there's not going to be the natural state of the moon. It's going to become too populated, at least with mining robots.
Right. And
some rationing scheme will have to be done. And while it'll probably be done the traditional way in war, we can wonder if there's a better way. For instance, if the moon was owned by humanity in the large.
So here's what I would do. I would start with the assumption that the moon is owned by humanity. And then I would auction it off to the highest bidder, with the proceeds being evenly distributed to everyone. Or auction parts of it off, or that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And which is what they did, like with the electromagnetic spectrum.
They didn't auction off; they just gave it away.
Well, it turns out that they auctioned it off for prices that were so low that it was essentially giving away, given how wireless technology is.
And that could end up happening with the moon too. Like if we auctioned it off today, and 50 years from now is when like the mining really starts to heat up, that kind of thing. And then they'll be like, oh, these guys basically got the moon for free. But you would also have a market at that point, like as the moon gets more valuable, people might start buying, from the previous owner, that kind of thing. I guess the question is, how do you get the market started in the first place?
Yeah, but I think that you just rent it out for little or nothing, and then if the moon value of a particular area increases, then its rent would increase.
Yeah. I think that's. And we would want to be kind of assessing the market value of land on the moon and taxing that property or charging rent on that property in general.
They're already selling moon titles right now. They have been for like 20 years.
So when you say moon titles, is it like you have exclusive access to this part of the moon, or is it more like a star registry where like you own this star as registered in this particular registry, and there are like 50 different registries all selling these stars?
You own the title to the section of the moon,
like the resources there, and you're allowed to put up a no trespassing sign, and people aren't allowed to go there.
I think so.
Ownership.
They actually filed they asked the UN if they could do that, and the UN never replied, so they're just selling it off.
Yeah, that sounds not legit at all.
Somebody's declared themselves the owner.
Yeah.
Well,
we'll see how that works out for them. I think it's going to work out great because they're making money selling plots on the moon, and then later on it doesn't matter. They don't care.
But they where the Apollo 11 landed, they set that up as a national park or international park or something like that. And
I agree with them there. Yeah.
Moon rush, my mom says. Okay, you guys ready for the next one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, bottom of page 10. The fault, however, is not in the present possessors. No complaint is intended or ought to be alleged against them unless they adopt the crime by opposing justice. The fault is in the system, and it has stolen imperceptibly upon the world, aided afterwards by the agrarian law of the sword. But the fault can be made to reform itself by successive generations, and without diminishing or deranging the property of any of the present possessors, the operation of the fund can yet commence, and be in full activity the first year of its establishment, or soon after, as I shall show. I guess we could probably keep going here. I think, so he's actually, what he's proposing to fund this thing is not what we think of as a property tax or a land value tax. He's proposing an inheritance tax based on a calculation of, how much of people's aggregate wealth and property, kind of corresponds to the shared inheritance of the natural land. That's kind of how he's rationalizing it.
It's to be like 50%. I think it said the last page.
What's that?
The inheritance tax would be 50% of the land.
I don't think.
That's what it said on the last page, I think. And that they have to pay back like 10% or something like that, and they post quarterly payback rates or something.
I think what he's saying. Yeah, I think what he's saying there is that the land might be 50% of the wealth, and he wants to tax 10% of it, or something like that. I don't know what the numbers are, and they don't particularly matter for what we're talking about.
Because it was never implemented, or
It doesn't matter because it was never implemented. It doesn't. The reason it doesn't matter is because we're talking about the concepts. I mean, I can find where he talks about the amount.
I do agree with the last paragraph that the current owners really can't be blamed because nobody really knows when ownership started. It started,
unless it's like in the U.S. where it's obvious when it started.
Yeah,
it's obviously the blame. Yeah.
But in France, you have to go back maybe to the beginning of agriculture in France, because it only with agriculture and people staying still did it really matter whose land it was. If you were nomadic and you were just leaving anyway, then it didn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
If you owned the land and you were just leaving. So somehow, and then in general, I'm told that agriculture sort of invented the injustice of hierarchy in human civilization. And that hunting and gathering tribes were much more equitable and non-competitive.
Yeah.
It was really with only in agriculture that somehow people stratified into the owner versus the peasants.
Yeah, I think certainly agriculture was the beginning of hierarchy. I don't know if I would call it the injustice of hierarchy.
But it took like thousands of years for people to actually, people in hunter-gatherer societies didn't have stunted growth that the beginning of agriculture had.
That's right. Yeah, and this is kind of, what related to the stuff Thomas Paine is talking about before and what we were talking about, that, the people who lived in tribes, they might die a violent death young or something like that, but they generally were not malnourished. Whereas once we learned to cultivate the land, there were, the vast majority of people were poor and malnourished. So let's go on to the next quote here. Okay. There we go. It is proposed that the payments, as already stated, be made to every person, rich or poor. It is best to make it so to prevent invidious distinctions. It is also right it should be so because it is in lieu of the natural inheritance, which, as a right, belongs to every man, over and above the property he may have created or inherited from those who did. Such persons as do not choose to receive it can throw it into the common fund. Yeah, so I think this is a common argument that's made for basic income, that you want to give it to rich people and poor people alike so that it doesn't create this class division or reinforce the class divisions that are already there.
Eliminate the stigma.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And then he's saying, he's also framing it in terms of the natural inheritance, which everyone shares equally. I would, in my framing, tweak that to say, everyone's a person, and we care about all people having access to the economy. So it's less about the natural. For me, it's less about the land. It's less about kind of inheritance. I feel like those are all excuses for saying that we want people to benefit. We care about people.
But doesn't your way run the risk of sounding more like charity than the dividend and rent collecting way?
It could. Depending on how, I think there is more risk. There's more risk if I phrase it. If I'm not careful in how I phrase it, people could interpret it that way. Yeah. But I think it's also true that and I think that has to do with the culture of work and feeling like people deserve to receive benefit when they've put something in. So what Paine does is he removes the everyone deserves equal stuff thing to another level that kind of obscures it. Because he's still ultimately saying all humans deserve this thing, but he's couching it in we inherited the earth equally. So it's like we inherited something that we earned, because or our ancestors earned, or something like that, because inheritance is typically thought about that way.
Right. Okay.
So he's using language that makes it feel less like charity and more in line with the you get what you deserve, you get rewarded for what you earn or what your ancestors earned, or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think in order for my way of talking about it to sound less like charity, it would probably involve a lot of cultural shift away from this feeling that people get what they get because they work for it.
Yeah, I'm inclined to make any argument for UBI that avoids charity or social or cultural issues at all.
Yeah.
But it turns out that the economic case for UBI is really good. In fact, I've gone so far as to say it's almost just standard Fed monetary policy, and you don't have to discuss charity or being nice to anybody. It's just the Fed running an economy.
We want the economy to work correctly.
Yeah,
and efficiently.
I think there's a particular problem with discussing charity and Americans being nice to other Americans, because at the moment all Americans seem to hate all other Americans. And so it's the universal part of the UBI is helpful because it just goes to everybody universally, including people who hate other people. It just sort of runs right over the top of that.
Yeah.
And I think at this polarized, nasty time in our history that's a good idea.
Yeah. My mom says, interesting similarity to Yang's argument that our data belongs to everyone, so should be the source of UBI. It's this common thing where these things are always justified in terms of or often justified in terms of owning something, shared ownership of something. And you deserve it because it's already yours, or something like that. So that's very similar, that's the Thomas Paine argument, that's the data argument as well. It's, I would draw an analogy to, if people are, suffering, you always want to try to find someone to blame, right? So Trump blamed immigrants and Yang blames automation, for economic problems and stuff like that. Being able to focus on an enemy or a scapegoat for the problems, and then being able to focus on an argument for why you deserve benefit as well. These kinds of I don't know if there's they're kind of shortcuts to moral, getting people. I don't know. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Well, so you're talking about the cultural and social arguments.
Yeah, it's sort of like with in Japan after the feudal era. They gathered up all the weapons to create these Buddha statues, and they melted them down into Buddha statues because everyone wanted to, because that was like socially acceptable. And so you want to create a socially acceptable reason for the UBI by getting a scapegoat out of robots and things.
Yeah, it's not your fault because someone is doing this to you. And then for the basic income argument, it's like it's not a handout because you already own it. So fitting these things in with people's existing moral narratives, I guess, is is the
Okay.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Thomas Paine is sort of well, he can be read as making a moral case. An injustice was done in the past, and so I think Joan made the analogy to reparations. And, but that is a slippery slope that I don't want to go down.
Right.
Because there's 100 of those past injustices or current injustices. And it's unlikely that, and nobody can agree on which injustice should actually be addressed. So I'm trying to, that all exists and I'm trying to avoid it.
And you think framing it as a shared ownership of the land and the dividend, you think you can do that without going down the slippery slope?
I don't know, because on the one hand, land ownership is just it's a mechanical economic issue.
Right.
It might be the first economic issue. I mean, you have to worry about property ownership before you even invented money or anything, right?
Right.
So on the one hand, it's just an economic thing. If I were Paine, I would stick to we're just fixing a past economic mechanical problem in the economy.
Okay.
Which he pretty much sticks to.
So rather than framing it as an injustice, he'd be like,
I've discovered another past injustice.
Yeah.
That needs to be, and some people need to get some money from some other people.
Yeah.
Which is, there's too many of them, it's not the way to go.
Right. Okay.
So I don't have an answer to that. As far as data being owned by the data creator, being owned by the computer user, I think that's a different thing.
Yeah.
And it's just
compensating for like labor or something like that.
It could be just again. It could be I must own my data because it came out of my hands. I must own my genome because it's inside my body, and we all agree that the inside of my body is owned by me. My body is owned by me.
I guess it depends what you mean by own.
Yeah.
Right. Like if you're saying people have a right to privacy and not having their information shared publicly, that kind of thing. That makes sense.
But there's like disagreement. Like a woman can say, "I own my body," but she doesn't own the thing inside of her, the fetus. But according to some people,
yeah. So what was I getting at?
Well, it is data.
Okay.
Getting paid for our data, is that remedying a past moral injustice?
Right. I think with data, it doesn't really make sense to say that you own some kind of like monetary value of your data, right?
Okay.
Because you're doing something and it generates data, and maybe control over whether that data gets collected, and privacy, data security, that kind of thing makes sense. But it's not like there's nothing. So Facebook already traded you for your data. They provided the service of Facebook. Yeah. You already got paid in the service, right? If you didn't want your data collected by Facebook, you could change your settings so that you've got different privacy settings, different data collection settings or something like that, or not use Facebook, right? But they are paying you with this service in exchange for, they benefit by being able to track trends and different things people are saying and all that kind of stuff. I mean, like, it's not something that's broken right now. It doesn't need to be fixed. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to leave that one aside because it's sort of economic. It might be economically perfectly solved.
Yeah, I think it is. I don't think it's a problem. I think
But then they sell and resell your data. and then you earn money from that, and you don't get anything from that.
Right. So I think some people looked at that and said, hey, wait a minute, this is all coming from me and it's making so much money. And of course, in aggregate, it looks like a lot of money, even though it's a tiny amount of money per person. But they looked at that and said, hey, wait a minute, don't I, deserve, something like that. So they kind of saw this and they're like, oh, well, we want, people to have more money anyway. And, this is a rationale for that and that kind of thing. I do think it's not a problem that needs to be solved. This is something that's already working correctly in the economy. Yeah. And it's true that people would benefit from having more money, but you don't need to justify it in terms of data. And that's something that's working fine. And even trying to define how much your data is worth and how much of the dividend you get is tricky. So what you end up doing if you actually want to implement something like this is you kind of aggregate, all the profits that all the tech companies get and tax some percentage of it and just hand it out to people. And then what you're doing is you're just giving people a basic income. And if we want to give people a basic income, we don't need to make that excuse in order to do it. Yeah.
Well, so to jump to the different example, there's reparations to African slaves.
Sure.
Me, an economist, could just say, oh yeah, we owe them some back pay, plus interest. But that seems to, while I like, the all-economic solution, that seems to miss the point of slavery.
Right.
The problem with slavery, it really is the moral problem. It's not the economic unfairness problem.
Well, it's also, the suffering that was caused and that people had to undergo, right? I mean,
punitive damages.
That's a real thing. It's not just
what I mean.
It's not just a moral. Okay.
Well, isn't that a moral?
I mean, you could make moral arguments about why you shouldn't hurt people and mistreat people, but the fact that they were hurt and suffering.
That is the point. That is the point of reparations. The fact that we owe them some back pay is not hardly the point. It's the suffering.
Right.
Slavery is the point.
And no amount of money we pay, people today is going to, make up for everything that has been happening. And I think it's true, if your data is misused, if your privacy is violated, something like that, it's not like the solution to that is oh, well, here's some money, right?
Yeah.
That's, that is something that needs to be addressed. You need to make sure it doesn't happen again and try to, make up for the damage that was done. That's not, it's not oh, people are using data irresponsibly, therefore you get a data dividend or something like that. We want data to be used responsibly, and we want to have the regulations and restrictions in place to make sure that people's privacy, data security is respected. And, then, within that framework, it's okay if Facebook makes money or something like that, that's not a problem. Yeah. I like that. That's a good analogy. So Eddie says, I would question whether people who sign on to Facebook have agreed to everything Facebook does with their data, though. Also, they've input their data into Facebook. But what if they change their mind and want to move to Yangbook? Can they have their data back? So it's an interesting question. It depends what you mean by data. Data could be all of the pictures you posted and stuff like that. I think there are rules in place that you should be able to download all the content you generated, that kind of thing. But then data can also be the pattern of clicks. Which ads did you click on? Where it wouldn't necessarily be something that transferring your pictures from Facebook to Yangbook might be something that makes sense, but transferring your usage data or what ads you're looking at or something like that is not probably something that Yangbook could make a very good use of. And that's the stuff mostly that these companies are making money off of. I guess they're looking at what content you're posting and correlating it with various things. I don't know. I think you're right that people don't necessarily know what happens with their data. It's really hard to define what their data even means. What is that? Just any we're generating data right now, right? We're on a live stream. You're getting some free data from us. You're welcome. But yeah, I think the whole data ownership, data dividends thing is not a useful framing for basic income or for thinking about privacy, thinking about how data should be managed. I think there are important data security and privacy issues, and being able to control and access the content that you've posted online. All of this stuff is really important. It's not about it's not ownership in the traditional sense of owning a thing. Yeah. Okay. I guess that's it. So Thomas Paine was not for a data dividend, but he was for indemnifying people for the loss of their natural inheritance of the earth. So let's go around and get people's final thoughts.
Yeah, Paine was for clearer thinking on ownership, in particular ownership of the land, but then it couldn't be ownership of all these other things.
Yeah.
And in compensating people for a mistake. But with Paine and with these other issues, I am failing to distinguish. I'm trying to keep it an economic issue rather than a moral or cultural or social issue, and I'm failing even with Thomas Paine.
Yeah. Richard.
Well, he's saying that he should be compensated because land was broken up into all these fragments and people were disinherited from those fragments, but land has always been broken up between the animals, fighting amongst themselves because they're over territory, chimpanzees having wars over territory, and humans, fighting over territory in their wars. So it's always been broken up. It's in various ways. And should we be fighting over, trying to get a part of it or not? We have to decide these things for ourselves.
Yeah. So I think I feel like the most important thing that Paine recognized was that we were improving in our technology, in our ability to support people's well-being and prosperity, and yet some people were becoming worse off, and that it didn't have to be that way. He layered a lot of various justifications on top of, why it's a good idea to give people money and how that should work. But I think that's the key fundamental insight, that society is growing and expanding in all of these different ways, yet we still have people who are being left behind, and we have the resources to not leave them behind. And I think that's something that's fundamental for basic income too. Our economy has the capacity, we have the resources to do better for people and to not have poverty. Do I think Thomas Paine was advocating basic income? No, I don't. I think he was still thinking about the world working in, people get their incomes from jobs, that kind of thing. You're only paying people when they retire, or, helping them have a more equal footing when they start out. But really only to the extent that they lost out on what they would have had in the natural state of the earth. And that is a very kind of low bar. He's recognizing that people are falling below that bar and he wants to bring them up to it, but he's not necessarily thinking, well, what could the highest bar be, which is what I like to think about.
He also advocates for a Social Security disability.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks for the discussion, guys. Sorry we went a little bit over. Got into some data dividend stuff. Next week we're talking about whether basic income should go to children, or to what extent. So see you guys next week.